In 2026, the calendar matters more than ever. Across the United States, execution dates are being set for men and women who have spent decades on death row. Some cases are remembered for shocking crimes, others for escapes, confessions, or legal battles that refuse to end. What connects them isn't just what they did, but how long the system took to decide what comes next. These are 16 inmates scheduled for execution in 2026, with cases that still raise questions long after the verdicts were read. Number 1. Charles Victor Thompson. A quiet place near Houston, late at night. A TV glow in the window. Cars parked out front. Nothing that screams crime scene. Then the stillness breaks with gunfire, and 2 lives are over in seconds. Police later said it wasn't a burglary, not a stranger, not a random beef. They said it was a relationship ending that detonated into a double murder. The case centers on 1998 in Harris County. At trial, jurors heard that Charles Victor Thompson went to the home of Denise Hayslip, his former girlfriend, after she had started seeing Darren Kane. Prosecutors said Thompson arrived angry and armed, and the confrontation ended with both Hayslip and Kane dead from a shooting. Thompson has acknowledged being the shooter, but he has argued issues of intent and responsibility in ways that did not persuade jurors or change the outcome. A jury sentenced him to death in 1999. That sentence was later overturned on a procedural issue, and in 2005, a new jury sentenced him to death again. Around the same time, Thompson pulled off a jail escape that sounded like fiction. Prosecutors alleged that while back in Houston for court, he walked out of the Harris County Jail disguised in street clothes, slipped past multiple checkpoints, and vanished, until authorities caught him days later in Louisiana. The escape kept his name in headlines long after the trial. His execution is scheduled for January 28, 2026 in Texas, at the Huntsville unit by lethal injection. Number 2. Ronald Palmer Heath. It starts like a normal night at a Gainesville bar. Small talk, drinks, strangers leaning close over loud music. Then a simple question about marijuana becomes the setup for a robbery, and a man who walked out alive never makes it back. Court records say that on May 24, 1989, Ronald Palmer Heath and his younger brother Kenneth were at the Purple Porpoise Lounge in Gainesville, Florida. They met Michael Sheridan, a traveling salesman. Sheridan bought drinks and asked about getting marijuana. Prosecutors said the brothers decided to take advantage of him. After leaving the bar, they drove to a secluded area in Alachua County. There, prosecutors said Kenneth pulled a gun and the robbery turned violent. Sheridan was shot and killed. What makes the case feel colder is the cleanup attempt prosecutors described. Investigators said the brothers went back, took more items, and later burned the rented car Sheridan had been driving, trying to erase the trail. It didn't work. The next day, they used Sheridan's credit cards at a mall, leaving a paper trail of receipts, times, and locations. Police followed that spending, and Kenneth's cooperation later reinforced the timeline. Heath was arrested in Georgia weeks later, convicted of first-degree murder and armed robbery, and sentenced to death. After decades on death row, the state issued a 2026 death warrant. His execution is scheduled for February 10, 2026, in Florida, at Florida State Prison by lethal injection. Number 3. Kendrick Antonio Simpson. A nightclub dispute in Oklahoma City should have ended with shouting, security lights, and everyone driving home angry. Prosecutors said it didn't. They said it turned into a rolling pursuit in the early morning dark, cars moving mile after mile, until gunfire shattered a stretch of road and 2 young men were dead. The case centers on the early hours of January 15, 2006. After an altercation at a nightclub, authorities said Kendrick Antonio Simpson and others followed a car carrying Glenn Palmer, 20, and Anthony Jones, 19, through Oklahoma City. Prosecutors described Simpson pulling alongside and firing an assault-style rifle into the vehicle, about 20 shots. Palmer and Jones were killed, and a third passenger survived from the back seat. Investigators also said at least 1 round hit a nearby home, showing how close the gunfire came to uninvolved families. Detectives tied the shooting back to the earlier confrontation, and prosecutors said the evidence pointed to Simpson as the shooter. 2 other men in Simpson's car later took plea deals and received lengthy prison terms, while Simpson faced the death penalty for the 2 deaths. He was convicted and sentenced to death twice in 2007. In January 2026, the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board voted 3-2 against recommending clemency after hearing arguments about his background and mental health claims. His execution is scheduled for February 12, 2026 in Oklahoma, at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester by lethal injection. Number 4. Cedric Ricks. On May 1, 2013, in Bedford, Texas, just outside Fort Worth, a 911 call comes in after midnight. Patrol cars roll into a quiet neighborhood and up to a house that looks perfectly normal from the curb. Porch light on. Cars in the driveway. Everything feels painfully ordinary. Inside, officers find the kind of silence that tells you the worst already happened. Investigators said this wasn't a broken window or a stranger in a mask. They said it was violence rooted in people who knew each other, in a place where everyone's guard is usually down. Prosecutors alleged Cedric Ricks attacked Roxanne Sanchez and her son, Anthony Figueroa, during a domestic blow-up. The state argued it wasn't an accident of rage and confusion. They said he acted on purpose, and the episode ended with 2 deaths in the same incident. Another child in the home survived and later testified, laying out a sequence for jurors: what unfolded, what was heard, and what happened immediately after. Police said Ricks left the scene, turning the first response into a search. Investigators built the case around witness accounts, physical evidence, and the survivor's testimony. At trial, the fight narrowed to intent and punishment. The jury convicted Ricks of capital murder and returned a death sentence. Courts later reviewed the record, but the sentence stayed in place as Texas moved toward a final date. His execution is officially set for March 11, 2026 in Huntsville, Texas by lethal injection. Number 5. James Broadnax. On June 19, 2008, late at night in Garland, Texas, outside a recording studio, 2 men step into a parking lot, and the night changes in seconds. A stranger closes distance, a robbery starts, and the person holding the gun isn't bluffing. What happens there doesn't stay in the dark, because the getaway creates a trail. That trail turns rumor into a name detectives can charge. Prosecutors said James Broadnax confronted Stephen Swan and Matthew Butler as they were leaving, demanding property. In the state's account, the robbery escalated immediately. Swan was shot and died there, and Butler was shot and later died from his injuries. Investigators said the shooter fled in Swan's vehicle, and that one decision mattered. It tied the escape to a specific car, a direction of travel, and witnesses who could describe what they saw. Police moved fast, and Broadnax was arrested soon after in Texarkana. What separates this file from many death penalty cases is the defendant's own words. Court records describe Broadnax confessing, and he later repeated that confession in interviews, saying he did it and showing no remorse. He even claimed he wanted the jury to sentence him to death. Prosecutors used that posture to argue identity and intent were settled, leaving jurors to decide punishment. In 2009, a jury convicted him of capital murder and returned a death sentence. On April 30, 2026, Texas is scheduled to execute Broadnax in Huntsville by lethal injection. Number 6. Edward Busby. In January 2004, in Fort Worth, Texas, it's midday. A 77-year-old retired educator finishes a grocery run, reaches for her car door, and then she's gone. Her car is still there. The parking lot keeps moving, and the quiet around her disappearance is what makes it terrifying. Detectives treated it as an abduction tied to theft, not a simple misunderstanding. The victim was Laura Lee Crane. Prosecutors alleged she was taken from a grocery store parking lot in Tarrant County during a robbery. From there, investigators followed what criminals often can't hide: money and movement. Transactions and card activity helped map out where the perpetrators went and how they tried to benefit. The trail didn't stop in Texas. It followed the cards quickly into Oklahoma. Court records describe Edward Busby Jr. admitting he and another man were involved in abducting Crane, robbing her, and that she was killed. He later tried to pin the plan on the other man, but the jury didn't buy that. After conviction, the calendar became part of the story. Each delay fed new filings, but the outcome never changed much. Appeals stretched on. Dates were set and then stopped, and the case lingered in limbo for years. Through those delays, the core facts stayed the same: a robbery that became an abduction and a death, and a defendant the state said helped make it happen. Busby is scheduled to be executed on May 14, 2026, in Huntsville, Texas, by lethal injection. Number 7. Tony Carruthers. On February 24, 1994, in Memphis, Tennessee, 3 young men vanish, and it doesn't feel like a normal missing person case. There's no sign of someone simply walking away. The last movements point into a drug world dispute where meetings happen for a reason, and leaving isn't always an option. For days, families wait for a call that never comes. Then the case turns into a triple homicide. On March 3, 1994, the victims are found in a Memphis cemetery, hidden in a grave. That discovery tells detectives this wasn't a sudden street fight. It was controlled, planned, and meant to make people disappear. Prosecutors said Tony Von Carruthers was a key figure in what happened, someone who wasn't just present, but involved in the decisions that led from a meetup to 3 deaths. Investigators built the case by tightening the timeline: who contacted whom, where the victims were last seen, and how the story moved from disappearance to burial. Witness accounts from inside that circle helped explain motive and identify the people responsible. In 1996, a jury convicted Carruthers of first-degree murder and sentenced him to death. Records list him as having multiple death sentences, reflecting the number of victims tied to the case, and Tennessee courts later left the punishment in place through major review stages. Tennessee has scheduled Carruthers' execution for May 21, 2026, in Nashville, at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution by lethal injection. Number 8. Gerald R. Hand. On July 2, 2002, in Delaware County, Ohio, gunshots erupt at a home, and 2 adults end up dead. The person police focus on isn't a stranger. He's tied to the victims by marriage, history, and a long trail of conflict that didn't start that day. Authorities say Gerald R. Hand shot his wife, Jill Hand, and her companion, Lonnie Welch. But the 2002 scene did something else. It forced investigators to look back at 2 older deaths that had never fully gone away. Court records describe how Hand's former wives, Donna in 1976 and Lori in 1979, each disappeared and were later found dead years before the 2002 killings. Prosecutors used those earlier cases to argue a pattern: relationships ending, someone vanishing, and Hand staying in control. In at least one account, life insurance money became part of the story the jury heard. At trial, the fight centered on motive and timeline: who was where, what was said, and what the evidence showed beyond doubt. A jury convicted Hand of aggravated murder and sentenced him to death. Ohio prison records also list an escape conviction tied to his incarceration history, adding another layer to how the system viewed his risk and behavior. Ohio has set Hand's execution for June 17, 2026, at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville by lethal injection, though Ohio has repeatedly postponed executions in recent years. Number 9. Cleveland R. Jackson. On March 3, 2002, in Lima, Ohio, before dawn, a robbery plan hits an apartment, and it doesn't stay a robbery. Shots rip through a room packed with people, and survivors have to tell detectives who had control and who pulled the trigger. By sunrise, Lima knows this isn't one victim, one mistake, one moment. It's a case that will leave a long list of charges. Prosecutors said Cleveland R. Jackson and his half-brother, Jerome Cunningham, entered the apartment to rob the occupants. The state alleged they demanded money and drugs, then opened fire while they had control of the room. 2 victims died, Jayla Grant, age 3, and Lanisha Williams, 17. Several others survived with injuries, and those survivors became key witnesses, describing the sequence, pointing to the shooters, and helping police connect the apartment attack to the robbery motive. Investigators also leaned on physical evidence from the scene to support what witnesses reported and tighten the timeline. In court, Jackson faced counts beyond the 2 deaths, including aggravated robbery and multiple attempted aggravated murder charges tied to the people who lived. A jury sentenced him to death. Ohio's highest court later upheld 1 death sentence while altering sentencing on another count, leaving him on death row. Jackson's execution is scheduled for July 15, 2026, at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville by lethal injection, with the date still subject to last-minute court stays. Number 10. Danny L. Hill. On September 10, 1985, in Warren, Ohio, it's early evening. A 12-year-old boy rides his bike toward a friend's house, cutting behind a store on Palmyra Road. He never arrives. Within hours, neighbors are searching ditches and tree lines, and what starts as missing hardens into a homicide investigation. The victim was Raymond Fife. Court records describe witnesses placing Danny L. Hill near the Value King area around the time Fife disappeared, along with reports of unusual sounds and movement in that backlot corridor. The state's case leaned on a tight timeline, where the boy was headed, who was seen nearby, and what the scene indicated happened in that short window. It wasn't driven by a dramatic confession. It was built from observations, location, and sequence that prosecutors said pointed to Hill. In 1986, a 3-judge panel sentenced Hill to death, and the case never truly left the courts for this killing. Decades later, the case is also defined by a different fight, whether Hill can legally be executed at all. His lawyers have argued he meets the standard for intellectual disability, which would bar execution, and that issue has moved through state and federal courts, including review at the U.S. Supreme Court. Hill remains on Ohio's execution calendar, even as Ohio has repeatedly postponed executions in recent years. Ohio has scheduled Danny L. Hill for execution on July 22, 2026, at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville by lethal injection. Number 11. Anthony Darrell Dugard Hines. On March 3, 1985, in Cheatham County, Tennessee, a motel worker starts what should be a normal shift. Then the night turns violent, and the case becomes the kind that sits in a community's memory for decades. By the time detectives close in, the story is no longer just about one room or one moment. It's about what the evidence says, and what it can't take back for years after. The victim was Catherine Jenkins. Prosecutors said Anthony Darrell Dugard Hines was responsible, pointing to testimony that placed him with the victim's vehicle after the attack, and to statements suggesting he admitted involvement. The case was tried in the mid-1980s, long before modern forensic storytelling took over TV, so the backbone was witness accounts, timeline, and credibility. Jurors had to decide whether the state's narrative held together, how Jenkins was attacked at the motel, and how the suspect, according to prosecutors, left the scene using her car. In January 1986, Hines was sentenced to death. Over the years, his case moved through appeals and federal review, including a major U.S. Supreme Court decision in 2021 that rejected a lower court ruling and kept his conviction and sentence in place. That legal turn became one of the defining chapters of the case. Tennessee has set Hines's execution for August 13, 2026, in Nashville, at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution. The state's default method is lethal injection, though prisoners convicted before 1999 may elect the electric chair. Number 12. James D. O'Neill. On December 11, 1993, in Cincinnati, Ohio, late at night in the Madisonville neighborhood, A marriage that had already been breaking down erupts into a final, terrifying confrontation. The emergency calls aren't about a stranger outside. They're about a husband forcing his way in, while the people inside are trying to get upstairs and get safe. Court records describe James D. O'Neill arriving at the home on Plainville Road, where his wife, Carol O'Neill, was staying. The relationship had a history of domestic violence and prior police responses. That night, prosecutors said O'Neill forced his way in, and as Carol and the children moved upstairs, he followed. Moments later, she was shot and killed. Police found him there that night, and he later admitted firing the gun. One of the most haunting details in the file is that the children were present, and the oldest son had to face the aftermath in real time. The case also carried a rare legal argument, whether a spouse can be treated as a trespasser in a home tied to the marriage. Appeals courts wrestled with that question as it related to aggravated burglary, but the bottom line stayed the same. O'Neill was convicted, and Ohio's highest court upheld the death sentence. Even on death row, Ohio's situation complicates what scheduled means. The state has repeatedly postponed executions in recent years. O'Neill is scheduled for execution on August 19, 2026, at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville by lethal injection. Number 13. Christa Pike. In January 1995, in Knoxville, Tennessee, near the University of Tennessee, a young woman disappears after a night that started with jealousy and rumors. Not long after, the case turns into a murder investigation, and detectives realize this isn't a stranger crime. It's a circle of teenagers and young adults who all know each other, and someone in that circle is lying. The victim was Colleen Slemmer, 18 years old, a Job Corps student. Prosecutors said Christa Gale Pike, also 18, was at the center of what happened. The state's theory was that Pike believed Slemmer had been spreading stories about her, and that anger turned into a planned confrontation. According to court accounts, Slemmer was lured to a secluded area and killed, and the group tried to treat it like something that would never be found. Investigators didn't buy that. They followed the people around Pike, tracked what was said after the fact, and built a case around witnesses and admissions. The trial ended with Pike receiving a death sentence. Over the years, her lawyers argued that her age, childhood trauma, and later mental health diagnoses should weigh against execution, while the state emphasized the brutality and what prosecutors described as a trophy taken from the victim. In prison, Pike was also convicted in a separate assault case, adding time on top of her sentence. Tennessee has scheduled Pike's execution for September 30, 2026, in Nashville at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution. The default method is lethal injection, though Tennessee law allows an electric chair election in certain cases. Number 14. Jerome Henderson. In July 1985, in Cincinnati, Ohio, in Hamilton County, a woman is attacked in her own home, and the case becomes a nightmare that doesn't end when police arrive. It ends in a courtroom years later, where the question isn't only who did it, but whether the state is allowed to carry out the ultimate punishment. Court records describe Jerome Henderson breaking into the victim's residence and committing aggravated murder, along with aggravated burglary and an attempted rape charge tied to the same incident. Henderson ultimately pleaded guilty, and the case moved straight into sentencing, where the court imposed the death penalty. The file is heavy, but the core point is clear. Prosecutors treated it as a home invasion that turned fatal, and the conviction has stood for decades. The modern chapter of this case is less about the original crime and more about Henderson's condition and competence. Recent litigation has focused on whether he qualifies for relief under Ohio's serious mental illness law, and on disputes about mental health evaluations and decision-making during the legal process. Those arguments have kept the case active even after years on death row. Ohio has set Henderson's execution for October 21, 2026, at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville, by lethal injection. But Ohio has repeatedly postponed executions in recent years, and state leaders have suggested lethal injection is practically unworkable without a new method, meaning this date remains subject to last-minute stays and reprieves. Number 15. Melvin D. Bonnell Jr. On November 28, 1987, in Cleveland, Ohio, just before sunrise, a knock comes at an apartment door on Bridge Avenue. Someone outside claims to be Charlie. Seconds later, gunfire erupts, and Robert Bunner, 22 years old, is dead. The surviving witness runs, calls police, and within minutes, the city is chasing a suspect through the streets. Investigators said Melvin D. Bonnell Jr. was the man behind the shooting. Court findings describe a fast chain of events: the attack, the witness escape, then a high-speed pursuit that ended when the suspect's car crashed into a funeral home. Police recovered a gun, and prosecutors relied heavily on ballistics and witness testimony to tie that weapon to the killing. The case moved quickly from a homicide scene to an arrest that looked, on paper, like police caught the right person almost immediately. Bonnell was convicted and sentenced to death in 1988, but the case didn't stay simple. Over the years, it became a battleground over evidence: what was preserved, what was disclosed, and what should be retested. Bonnell sought DNA testing decades later, and Ohio courts rejected that request. Critics and defense filings have also argued that key physical evidence was mishandled or hidden, while prosecutors maintain the conviction was supported by the trial record. Ohio scheduled Bonnell's execution for November 18, 2026, at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville by lethal injection, though Ohio's repeated execution delays make the date subject to change. Number 16. Gary Wayne Sutton. In August 1992, in Maryville, Tennessee, late at night, a bar run turns into police lights when Tommy Griffin is arrested for public intoxication. Not long after, Griffin is out again, bonded out by two men he'd been drinking with. Within hours, shots are reportedly heard near Little River, and Griffin is gone. Days later, his body is found, and what looked like a messy night out becomes a murder case that will hang over East Tennessee for decades. Prosecutors said Gary Wayne Sutton and his uncle, James Henderson Dellinger, were the last people with Griffin before he disappeared. They argued the timeline tells the story: drinking together, a quick trip through jail, then release, followed by gunfire and a dead man. The case didn't stop with Griffin. Investigators also connected Sutton and Dellinger to the death of Griffin's sister, Connie Branham. Court records describe her being found dead inside a burned vehicle in a wooded area in Sevier County, a discovery that suggested someone was trying to wipe out evidence and close off witnesses. Sutton has maintained his innocence, and supporters have argued the evidence and witness statements don't add up. Still, the courts upheld the convictions and the death sentence, and Sutton remains on Tennessee's execution calendar. Tennessee has set Sutton's execution for December 3, 2026, in Nashville at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution. The state's default method is lethal injection under its current protocol, though Tennessee law allows an electric chair election for certain older cases, and the final method will be confirmed before the date.